Hello everyone, welcome to video number 6 of the American Home Brewers Instructional Video Series. This video is entitled Brewing Your First Batch. By the end of this presentation, you should have a pretty good idea on how to brew beer, and you should be able to brew your own beer from an ingredient kit purchased from either the American Home Brewer or from any other home brew retailer. So let's get started. First, it's always a good idea to be sure you have all the tools necessary to brew before you begin. The tools we'll be using today include a water source, either tap or bottled, a fire source, which usually is your kitchen, a mashing pot if your recipe requires that you mash some grain, a brew pot large enough to hold a quantity of beer that you intend to brew, a strainer or muslin bags for grains and hops, a stirring spoon, your fermentation kit, measuring cups or containers, a rag, and of course the ingredients, either purchased separately or in an ingredient kit. If you don't have a brew pot large enough to hold 2.5 or 5 gallons worth of liquid, you can always break it up into 2 separate batches. Just make sure you use equal amounts of ingredients in each batch. Now, if you're missing any of the tools, it's probably a good idea not to start brewing until you have them all at your disposal. For today's demonstration, we'll be brewing an American Home Brewer ingredient kit. This beer is called Sunset Beach Blonde Ale. Now, Sunset Beach is a full-bodied, light-colored ale with a light hop aroma and a smooth finish. So, the first thing we're going to do is open the ingredient kit, find the recipe sheet, and then verify that we have all the ingredients required to brew. It's a good idea to remove the ingredients and lay them out on a table so you can check them against the recipe sheet one by one. Let's start with the malt extract. The recipe tells us we need 3 pounds of pale liquid malt extract, and here it is. Next, the recipe sheet tells us we need a total of 8 ounces of specialty grain, and that's this bag right here. We have 2 hop additions in this recipe, so we're looking for 2 different bags of hops. Here's hop addition number 1, and here's hop addition number 2. So far, so good. Next, the recipe tells us that we'll be adding Irish moss as a fining, and that's this little bag of gray powder right here. And finally, we're looking for 6 grams of Munton's Premium Gold Ale yeast, and that's this little envelope right here. So, it looks like we have everything we need to brew, so go ahead and put everything back in the box so the dog doesn't go running away with it, and we'll start at line number 1 of the instructions. You'll find the instructions at the very bottom of your recipe sheet. Okay, starting at line 1 of the instructions, it tells us in a small mash pot to bring 3 quarts of water to 160 degrees. And to check the temperature. Here I have a 1-gallon milk jug, which I've divided into quarts, so I'll pour 3 quarts of water in the mash pot and turn on the fire. Using the digital thermometer in the fermentation kit, I'm going to check the temperature every few minutes until we're close to or at 160 degrees. The instructions now tell us that when the water is at 160 to shut off the heat and pour in the bag of specialty grain. So we'll pour in the grains, give them a nice stir, cover the pot, and we'll set a timer for 30 minutes as indicated in the instructions. Now, referring back to the instructions, line 3 says, while mashing, we should begin to heat 2.5 gallons of water in our large brew pot. So we'll measure out 2.5 gallons of water, pour it into the brew pot, and turn on the fire. Here I'm using a double burner system to heat the water a little bit quicker. Line 4 of the instructions tells us that when the water in the brew pot reaches 165, we should remove 8 cups of that water and set it aside. The reason we do this is because the water will be used in sparging a little bit later, and sparging means rinsing grains. But because we don't need it quite yet, we'll remove it at 165, and as it sits around, it'll cool down to around 160. Now that we've removed our sparge water, we'll allow our brew pot to come to a rolling boil. Now this can take from 10 to 20 minutes depending on your fire source and how much water you're boiling. If you place the lid on your brew pot, this will speed things up a little bit. Okay, the instructions now tell us to add the liquid malt extract when the water is at a rolling boil. Now here's a quick tip when using liquid malt extract. The extract is very thick. It's a lot like molasses right now. To thin it a little bit, grab a bowl, fill the bowl with hot tap water, and place your extract container upside down in the hot tap water for about 5 minutes. Don't use boiling water for this, And never ever place your extract container in the microwave. The hot water will thin the extract and make it easy to open and easy to pour. Now that we've done that, let's add the extract to our boiling pot. We need to stir for at least a minute or two to make sure all the extract has completely dissolved. Whatever you do, don't let any extract accumulate at the bottom of your pot or you will burn it, and that will definitely affect the flavor of your beer later on. Now that we've dissolved the liquid extract in our boiling pot, the mash should just be about ready. It's time to get the mash liquid, or liquor as it's referred to at this point, into our boiling pot. Now, if you used a muslin grain bag for mashing, you will not need a strainer. But if you didn't, locate your strainer and place it over your brew pot. Now, take the mash pot and pour all the contents through the strainer into the brew pot, including the grain. Once you have only the grain left in your strainer, grab those 8 cups of water you removed earlier and pour them over the grain slowly. This is called sparging. When we sparge, we're removing every last fermentable possible from the grain. Once you've sparged, toss the grain in the trash immediately. Dogs love the smell of spent grain, and they'll try to eat it. However, spent grain can make a dog really sick and in some cases kill a dog. So put the grain in a plastic bag and trash it right away. Okay, so now we need to wait for the brew pot to come back up to a rolling boil. Remember, that's when we physically see large bubbles. Once it comes back to a rolling boil, the instructions tell us to set a timer for 60 minutes. The next line of the instructions tells us that once we've set the timer for 60 minutes, we should add our first hop addition. If you notice in the hop schedule, it says the first addition of hops requires a 60-minute boil time. So, locate the bag of hops that says addition number 1 and pour the bag into your brew pot. Stir the wort for about 30 seconds or so and then place the lid on the pot, but don't cover the pot entirely. Allow the lid to cover only about 75% of the pot. If you have a muslin hop bag, go ahead and fill the bag with your first hop addition, then drop the bag into your brew pot. Give it a couple of stirs there until all the hops are wet and you're good to go. Okay, based on the instructions, there's really nothing to do for the next 45 minutes except stir wort. So every 10 minutes or so, give the wort a nice stir and then place the lid back on the pot, leaving it cracked open a little bit. In 45 minutes, we'll be adding the Irish moss, but for now, we just want to keep the wort boiling with a few nice stirs in between. All right, 45 minutes have passed and there's 15 minutes left in our boil. It's time to add the Irish moss. So locate the package, open it up, pour it into your wort, and stir until it's fully dissolved. Next, the instructions tell us that we need to add the second hop addition with 5 minutes left in the boil. So, after your wort has boiled for 55 minutes, go ahead and pour in hop addition number 2. If you're using a muslin hop bag, fish out the bag from your brew pot, open it up, stuff it with your second hop addition, retie it, and place it back in your pot. All right, our 1 hour boil is up. It's time to kill the fire and prepare to cool the wort to yeast pitching temperature. Our recipe tells us that pitching temperature for this beer is between 70 and 78 degrees. So it's really important for us to get that wort down to this temperature before we add any yeast. You cannot add yeast to hot wort. You will kill it instantly. The most efficient way is to use a wort chiller like this one. However, we understand that first-timers may not want to invest in a wort chiller, and that's fine. So there are other ways, and one of them is to prepare an ice bath in your sink. But before we explain how to do that, there is one very important detail that you must remember from here on in. Anything and everything that touches your wort from now on must be completely sanitized first. This is when your wort is most vulnerable to stray bacteria and contamination, even more so than when it's fermenting. That's because when it's fermenting, you have a bucket that has an airtight lid, and it's protecting the wort. So before you introduce anything into your wort, even the stirring spoon, you need to prepare some sanitizer. So let's do that. Your fermentation kit came with 2 buckets, a fermentation bucket and a bottling bucket. We'll be using the fermentation bucket shortly, but we won't be using the bottling bucket. So grab the bottling bucket, the one with the spigot, and fill it with about 3 gallons of water. Now get your iodophor sanitizer and add 1 capful of sanitizer to the water. You can use your stirring spoon to stir it. Now drop your spoon in the sanitizing solution and leave it there for a minute or 2. Only now can you use that stirring spoon to stir your wort. After stirring, put your spoon back in the sanitizing bucket. Also, it's a good idea now to fill a tall glass with sanitizing solution. Grab your digital thermometer and place the probe end of it into the glass and leave it there. Each time you take a temperature, put the thermometer back in the glass. Now, getting back to our ice bath. What you do now is you fill your sink with a couple inches of water and you place your brew pot in the sink. Now surround the pot with as much ice as you can. Once the brew pot and the ice are in the sink, fill the sink with water. Stir the wort every few minutes to encourage cooling, and your wort will cool down in about 30 to 45 minutes. Once your wort has reached pitching temperature, in this case between 70 and 78 degrees, it's time to get it into your fermentation bucket. But first, we have to make sure that the fermentation bucket has been sanitized. Remember, anything that touches your wort from here on in must be sanitized. The easiest way to sanitize your fermentation bucket is to fill it with some of your sanitizing solution. About 3 cupfuls is fine. Now put the lid on your fermentation bucket, make sure you put your finger over the grommet hole, and swish everything around for about a minute. Done. Now, if you have a strainer, place it into your sanitizing bucket for a minute or 2 to make sure that it is sanitized. Then place it over your fermentation bucket. If you have access to some cheesecloth or purchase some from the American Home Brewer, the cheesecloth will strain out even the smallest of particles from your wort, and it's a good idea to use it if you have it. Now, go ahead and pour your wort directly into your fermentation bucket. You may notice some very small particles in your wort, but don't worry about those now. Eventually, after fermentation is complete, they'll fall to the bottom and they won't be a problem. Okay, once you have all your wort in the fermentation bucket, it's time to place all 3 parts of your airlock in the sanitizing solution for a minute or 2. Also, if you're interested in taking a gravity reading, this is the time to do it. You should always take a starting gravity reading prior to adding the yeast. So, grab your hydrometer, the test jar, and a metal or ceramic cup and place them in your sanitizing solution. Now grab some wort with your cup and fill your test jar about 3/4 of the way full. Insert your hydrometer and take a reading where the surface of the liquid meets the side of the hydrometer. Record this number on a piece of paper and put it away for safekeeping. You're going to need this number when fermentation is complete to determine the alcohol content of your beer. While your airlock is sanitizing, locate your package of yeast. Now cut off the corner and pour your yeast over the top of your wort. Once you've pitched the yeast, fish out the body of the airlock and insert it into the grommeted hole in the lid. Once the airlock is inserted nice and tight into the lid, put the lid on your fermentation bucket. Now fill the airlock about halfway up with water, drop in the valve, and install the cap. Well, you did it. You brewed a batch of beer. You are done. Find a nice home for your bucket where the temperature will remain between 65 and 78 degrees, and in a few days you'll have the best beer you've ever had. That's because you made it yourself. Check your airlock tomorrow for bubbles every few seconds. That means your yeast is happy and fermenting away. Well, that concludes this presentation on brewing your first batch of beer. We hope it was helpful. Remember, the American Home Brewer sells several beer ingredient kits that include TILF-certified 100% organic malts that produce quality beers. The kits are available in either 2.5 or 5-gallon sizes, and they contain everything you need to brew right out of the box. Until next time, happy brewing.